All right, Trogonomics, here we go. Good to see you again, Trog. We're on episode 5, season 1. We've talked a lot about, in the last couple of episodes, we've talked a lot about how you're managing your money, your income, and your family budget, your kids' budget, how you're teaching them about money. And one of the components that's come out of that is savings, both teaching your kids about savings, but also managing your income, your saving strategy, your retirement plan with your partner. And I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive here because this is something that I think can be quite intimidating. It's anonymous as well. So like if you don't make that deposit into that account, nobody's going to know. It can also be a little overwhelming because there's lots of different ways you can save. There's lots of different things you need to save for. And there's also not always tons of income just lying around. So let's kind of get into it. I want to talk a little bit about where do we start and how do you think about savings? Welcome, of course, to the conversation, and give us a little bit of maybe just an overhead view of your thoughts here.
Yeah. So, when we talked about what we're trying to teach the kids, we had a couple different buckets. One was long-term and one was shorter, medium term. And I think about, my income and savings in the same way. And when I think about prioritization, I think honestly, the first two things I think about are one is a short term and one is a long term. The short term is having enough buffer, kind of an emergency fund, so that if something goes wrong, you can keep your lifestyle going and not go into a lot of debt and things like that. So that's really important, but that's also relatively, short term. It's, you want to save that up relatively quickly. You might need to use it relatively quickly. And then the other part of that barbell would be the long-term stuff. So thinking about retirement, but I think maybe what might be more motivational is thinking about the fact that you probably won't be able to work forever. Like there's going to be a time where you just won't be able to work anymore, and you'll need some way to support yourself or maybe someone else. And planning for that, because there's not a lot of other ways to finance that, unlike other things you could be saving for, like college or a car, where it's pretty easy to borrow. There's lots of ways to skin that cat, but at some point you're going to have some money that you're living off of without work. And so I like to prioritize that really high as well.
That's a great point that you made about college savings, in that if you get to your kids starting college and you haven't made the commitment, the full investment, you can borrow money. And the government, depending on what the world is going to be like in 10 or 15 years, but in the last 10 to 30, 40 years, you can borrow pretty cheaply against your future earnings and college funding. So that's a great example of, at the end of the day, you can't borrow money to live on when you're 80.
That's right. Yeah.
Unless you're just rolling up that credit card or doing, some of those kind of scarier things like reverse mortgages or, taking out cost of living loans or things like that. And that's something that, with that in mind, is that where you're putting your top priority is end of career savings?
Yeah. So that for us, we've been doing this long enough that we've been able to build up our emergency fund. And the next thing is the long-term stuff. I've had some younger friends that, as they get married and things, ask me about how to prioritize those two things. Like, so, it's usually, you hear a rule of thumb that for the emergency fund part, you probably want a minimum 3 months. Some people go all the way up to a year. I kind of like the 6-month version of that, of expenses, right? Now, these are bare bones expenses, right? So if you're having to use this money, you're out of work, you're having trouble getting a job, like you're not going to be spending on a lot of the discretionary stuff. So that's kind of what we mean with the 3 to 6 months.
Zero income coming in. So it's not even like you have a side hustle or two. It's, I'm at zero and I'm drawing, I got 3 months to go.
That's what I like to plan for. Yeah.
Or 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that can take a little while to build up. Like when we were young married folks, trying to get through on graduate stipends and things like that, our expenses weren't that high. So that helped. It wasn't, the dollar figure wasn't as high to cover 6 months of our living, but it was tough to build that up. At the same time, I don't think you want to completely ignore the long term, especially if the job that you're in as you're trying to build up that emergency fund has things like retirement matches, right? So if your employer is willing to put in a certain match percentage into a 401k or a 403b, whatever their retirement plan is, I usually tell my younger friends that are just starting out to do both, to contribute at least what they need to get the free money from the employer, and then start focusing on that emergency fund. So I think those are usually like my 1 and 2 for at least for the first few years once you get started out.
Okay. So number one priority is saving for retirement. Within that, we're going to match as much as our employer will give us free money. And that's something that I think that's just pretty common knowledge, is if the employer says, hey, we've got a matching program, take it. Take it. It's free money.
Right.
You don't, at the early stages when you're still trying to accumulate, fill up some of these buckets of savings, just match it and stop there. Don't over save. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think at least until you get that emergency fund together. Because what that emergency fund is going to allow you to do is it's going to give you a lot of choices that we'll get into in the next few minutes about now what do I do with the rest of my savings, right?
Right.
Because you get one, you start building a habit for putting some money away, but there's a specified amount that you need. And when you get to that, one, you're confident, you can roll with when something bad happens, and that all that money you were saving for that goal can now be put to other goals. And so we can have a larger conversation. You're comfortable, you're sleeping at night, and you now have, believe it or not, some extra money, or might feel like extra money. And then we can talk about kind of what to do with the other types of things that you save for.
Yeah. So that emergency fund is a significant priority.
Yeah. I think so. It does depend. So I think the one caveat, it kind of depends on the work that you do. So in my current situation, I'm a tenured professor married to a nurse. We are probably going to have jobs,
Right.
Mine's very hard to lose at this point. And, my partner is in an industry that is always in need of people. We may choose to carry a little bit less, we may do more of a 3-month version than a 6-month version, because the odds that both of us lose jobs in these fields is really, really low. Now, if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm a gig economy person where I might have a gangbuster month or two, and then maybe it's dry for a little bit, and then, and it's up and down, like I may push it to more like a 6 to 12 month, just to act as a buffer and smooth things out a little bit. So it does depend on kind of where you are in your life and how many people you're supporting and those kind of things. But like, what's the downside if you lose your job? Like, how are you going to cover things? If you've got a working partner, that helps a lot. If you've got some parents that can help out, that helps. If you've got a side gig that can at least, pay the rent, that helps. But you want to be able to cover that, like you said, that worst case scenario of, okay, let's just say the economy shuts down and nothing's coming in for a few months. You want to be able to cover something like that.
When you went through the process, when you and your partner were, you're kind of wrapping up grad school, she was wrapping up nursing school, you're starting to financially have some freedom, and maybe even transitioning into those first jobs out of graduate school. Now you've got a little bit of a savings plan for your retirement, and you're working towards this emergency fund bucket. How long did you create the runway to fill that bucket? And what was your approach to your income as it relates to that filling up of that bucket?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it probably took us somewhere between 12 and 18 months to get there for the emergency fund. And memories are a little fuzzy, but it's not something that's going to happen in a couple months. Like, it's going to take some time to build that up. Sorry, Brett, what was your second question?
So the thing that I find intimidating about savings is, let's say I make $1,000 a month, right? And my cost of living is, $250, maybe $350 if I shave everything down. Am I is it okay if it's 15, 20% of my income that I'm
Right.
breaking off? Is it okay if it's 8% of my income that I'm breaking off? Like when you're thinking about, I need to save for 6 months, to your point, in order for you to save for 6 months of living, you're not going to be able to do it in 2 months because
Right.
you have those 2 months, like, unless there's just this, up and down of money. Like maybe you're a contract musician where you got a big upfront payment that you kind of have to live off of. You can just like, okay, I'm going to rat hole this away and then live off of it. But in a more traditional sense, you're making that $1,000 month after month after month. And then you want to be able to somehow put away $6,000. This is obviously a very simplified equation, but you want to put away $6,000 into that bucket. And you're saying it takes you, a year and a half. With that in mind, how much are you putting away each month compared to your income? And did it fluctuate? Did you ever feel like, yeah, we're a little bit tight on money, but I got to make sure I get that put away? Or was it like, you know what, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive next month? This month, holidays are coming around. Maybe there's a little bit more income that needs to be spent in other ways. How do you approach those little speed bumps? Because it's just not this perfectly smooth,
Right.
turbulence-free flight of life.
Right. Right. So I think there's a couple approaches, and we probably did a little bit of a mix of both. So I think the sort of like fully mathematical, rational approach would say, here's how much I need. Here's when I need it by. Here's if I'm going to get any return on this, what is it? Now for an emergency fund, it's probably close to zero, right? I mean, this is mainly cash in a savings account. So, and I guess that's mainly it, right? So you can do a sort of a payment formula in Excel, and it'll tell you if I need $6,000 in 18 months, you need to put this much away a month, right? So that's like the sort of fully just rational, like this will get me where I'm going for sure, right? The other approach is more of a rule of thumb, right? So you may have heard some of these, like, well, you got to put at least 10% of away for savings or 15%. People have different thumbs to make these rules for, but that's another approach. And honestly, looking back personally, we probably did a little bit of a mix. So I think what I use the rule of thumb, the 10 or 15%.
Yep.
And that was baked in a sense that we never saw that money. So you mentioned kind of how do you keep from cheating yourself and things like that.
Yeah.
So, now this would be called sort of a behavioral economics kind of approach where you're taking into account the psychology of it. But if you automate a chunk of your savings in a sense that as soon as your paycheck hits, it goes somewhere else and you never really have a chance to consume it, that will do a lot of the psychological work for you. And then it gives you something, now you're started, right? It may not be all of what you would need to reach a certain goal, but you're at least moving, you're on the way, and it's not something you have to think about anymore, right? Like you automate it and then you kind of forget about it. And then what we would do is if we had a good month, or if we, again, maybe you have an opportunity to do something like a short-term side gig, or somebody's got a project they want you to help with, well, then we can prioritize the extra money coming in and say, this will help us get to this goal faster, and we can tag that on top. So especially, again, it kind of depends on where you are in your life when you're doing this. So when we were young and just not making that much money, the rule of thumb was good for us because it was hard to look at an 18-month plan, right? And say,
Right.
because that number can come back and it may just be demotivating, right? It says I need to put $600 a month away. I don't have $600 a month. Now what do I do, right? Whereas the rule of thumb, like, well, I've got $200 a month going in no matter what, right? And then we can figure out how to bridge that gap. So
you bring up a good point. When you're at the beginning of your adult financial independence, let's say you're in month 2 or month 3, and then your plan says you have to save for 18 months or even 24 months. Like, that's like telling a 2-year-old you have to wait until you're 12 years old before you can do something. Like, that's forever from now, which can be very intimidating and very frustrating. And your peer group may not be in that same world that you're in. Your influences on you may not be in that world. Your parents may not have given you that same, code of conduct or sense of internal responsibility. So when you're in month 2, and you're trying to think about, like, okay, I need to save for not having a job, which, again, like if you're early in your career, early in your adult life, like you're kind of bulletproof. Like I was, I'm sure, you kind of just like, I got a good education. I'm a hustler. I'm going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And then it's just like, oh no, it's not fine. Like where did this come out of left field? So I love the idea of like, when you set up your direct deposit with your employer, you can create multiple accounts and you can break it up, whether it's you and your partner each get a certain amount of money and then the savings account gets a certain amount of money or something like that, but you never actually see it. So when you get up on payday and you look at your bank statement, that's your disposable, that's your bills, that's your spending money, and you've already addressed that. On top of that, if you have a moment of maybe February, your bills aren't quite as high because it's a shorter month, B, there's no big holidays, like maybe there's no birthdays, there's no things like that, where graduations where you may have to pick up a few extra things, then you can throw an extra couple $100 into that. So that when June comes around and all your friends are getting married, or, December comes around and you're going holiday shopping.
One little trick like that, especially if you get paid bi-weekly, is, you're going to get a couple months with an extra paycheck. And those are perfect for things like this too, right? Because if you kind of make your budget on 2 paychecks a month, and you haven't committed the other stuff, it's really easy to earmark that to help boost some goals along.
That's a great point. Yeah. That's, every year there's 2 months where you get a third paycheck. And that, that brings up a whole nother conversation. Like what, you get a nice little windfall of a couple $1,000s. You've already paid your rent or your mortgage. You've already paid your living expenses. How do you break that extra money up? Or if there's just, a couple bucks falls your way for whatever reason, in relation to savings, how do you both, quench your thirst for a little bit of fun and quench your thirst for a little bit of safety?
Yeah. So
how do you personally do that?
Yeah. So when I got extra money, I like to think about, think like a waterfall, right? And you can think about like a series of, you've seen those like things at weddings, right? Where they have all the champagne glasses and they pour the champagne down and come, right? So
I believe at Golden Corral, it's a chocolate fondue fountain that basically comes out like that. If you haven't eaten there, that's okay.
So what I like to think about is having that pyramid built right before the money comes in, and you're going to start with your number one priority. And when you get to where you want to be on that one, then you look to what your next one is. Right. And so basically what we've said so far is match for retirement, right? You got to keep an eye on the long term. So start there. Next one would be like an emergency fund, right? But once you've filled those things up, now you've got to figure out, well, what's the next champagne glass down, that comes down next. And,
Gotcha.
And, this is where, again, the rules of thumb get you so far, but they don't really answer this question, right? So even if I am putting my 15% away, like, again, once I start meeting some of these goals, I'm still going to figure out what to do with the next money that comes in. Personally, I like to make sure, this is where I like to go back to that kind of fully mathematical, rational answer. And we talked earlier about the importance of, having a nest egg when you're old and you're not able to work anymore, maybe you just don't want to work, is, think through, like, what would your kind of ideal situation be? Like, do you think 60 sounds good? Do you go right to full Social Security age? You love your job, maybe you'll go a little bit longer, but, put a target on it and do some back of the envelope math and get a sense of like, okay, well, what would that mean per month for the next couple decades? And get serious about that, right? Because you've got, especially when you're younger, the earlier you can start that process, the more time you have to have all the compounding and the interest build. And so I still like to kind of return to the long term on that, where are we at, our third champagne glass. I still like to go back and think about the long term and really make sure it's where you want to be before I then start thinking about other buckets for savings. And these, those are some of the maybe middle term goals, like, house down payment, weddings, college tuition for kids, those kind of things would be kind of the next layer down.
I love that analogy. So once you kind of fill up those buckets on a windfall moment, you can kind of go back and experiment a little bit. And I think one of the things that you're very good at, whether it is probably a combination of a little bit of natural ability, but also some very honed practiced ability, is your lack of emotion with money. So when that July 3rd check comes around this year, you don't have a X, Y, and Z that you're just, every day you're looking online, ready to buy it. But I think that's a little bit on the rare side, right? Like there's still a little bit of that, like, hey, I wouldn't mind having a new whatever, or maybe I could treat my partner to this, or my kids have been wanting new whatever, or maybe there's a vacation or something there. Like if we can knock out those first couple of buckets with that extra, and then maybe just round up a little bit more, seeing as there's some more money, does that come out, or do you ever think about that relationship of enjoying the money in the moment and enjoying the money in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, so what I do with the big purchases, right? The spa day, the weekend to the beach, that kind of stuff. I honestly just think about that in my month-to-month budget. So it's not an expense that will hit every month, but I build into the budget sort of, an average monthly cost if I want to do something, so let's say we want to take 2 trips a year. They're each going to
Yeah.
cost us, $1,500. So that's $3,000 that I spread out over the year, and it's in my spending budget. So I don't necessarily have to do anything special for it. The months that I don't do it, that just kind of builds up in the savings account, and then it's there on the months that I do want to use it. And then, so in some ways, I actually kind of take it out of what I would consider a savings bucket, and I've budgeted it as spending, and I've just kind of amortized it over the entire year, if you will.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how I've kind of psychologically dealt with the big purchase kind of decision.
In real time, let's say we're in a month where that bucket for the vacation, it doesn't get executed, right? This is April, and that vacation is in August. So that $300 that's going to be there, do you leave it in your liquid checking account, or do you siphon it off to another account? Like, how do you make sure that that doesn't, although we're recording daily, we're balancing our checkbook and we're recording everything in the spreadsheet. How do you make sure that that 300 doesn't just kind of wander off to, Amazon or the grocery store, or maybe a fun night out with some friends or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, this is very, I think, kind of personality dependent. Again,
Certainly.
for me, I just kind of leave it in the checking account. The act of tracking our spending that we've talked about in earlier episodes is enough for me just to keep it in front of mind. But I have definitely heard people create, a lot of banks now will let you create kind of these sub accounts where you can specifically say, this is our trip fund, right?
Yeah.
And again, from kind of the behavioral economics side, you're trying to get it out of something that you're tempted by. So it's called a commitment device. You're basically saying, I don't even want to be tempted by this. I'm going to remove the possibility that I can spend this out of my regular checking account, because I'm just going to squirrel it away in an account that's slightly harder to get to, right? And that's totally fine. And it's just a matter of kind of knowing yourself and which is going to make the most sense for you. I mean, some people literally put in physical envelopes and, hide it behind the cookie jar, but I think psychologically you just want to take the temptation away, because it's hard day after day. If you're the type that likes to check your numbers, and as soon as you start seeing it up, you start thinking about how you can spend it, I would seriously consider trying to hide it from yourself so that you're never even tempted. You don't see it as extra money.
Yeah. I have a little different approach than you do. And again, you and I have very different emotional reactions. Like I do the daily balancing the checkbook. I look at the spreadsheet. I feel good when, I turn my bills over and I can see those things add up, and I feel good when I have my savings done. But when there's those little extra things, I actually move $100 to $300 per paycheck of leftover money or kind of earmarked money into an E-Trade cash account that's separate from my bank, that takes about 36 hours to transfer both in and out. And I also don't look at my E-Trade account very often for that exact reason. And it's literally like, I can't see it. I can't know, because when I have gone through financial difficulties, it makes me very insecure and very discouraged. But when I go through financial upswings, I get very confident and I get very I get a lot of like, oh man, I'm doing great. I'm, financially my success is on point. Like, let's celebrate a little bit. Let's order an appetizer at the restaurant or something, and then that turns into like, well, I just spent like $800 at the taco shop for the last 2 months. So I think your point initially was is very perfect in that everyone's personality is different. Identify it, and then make sure that you can execute against who you are being vulnerable to, and how honest you're being with yourself.
Yep.
In some cases, it's like, yeah, it's in the checking account, not worried about it. I'm good. I see it there. I see it on the spreadsheet. In some cases, it's like, hide this in the basement. Let's talk a little bit about like short-term saving. When there's kind of two prongs to this question I want to ask you. One is when you are early in your financial life, just you and your partner, and again, we're talking about it's taking you 18 months to get that emergency fund built up, which was a priority. You've kickstarted your long-term savings priority. You're not making a ton of money, and you want to go on a vacation, or you want to go home and visit your family for the holidays, or friends are getting married and you need to travel, for a week to the wedding site. You have to buy a new suit. You have to, get gifts and all those types of things. How did you prioritize? How did you make this work? And then now that security money the bucket is full, and the income is a little bit higher, but there's also kids now, and there's camps, and there's soccer, teams and stuff like that. How do you think about that now? When we're trying to save for maybe that 1 or 2 vacations a year, in kind of a relationship to your income, and also like your prioritization.
Right. I mean, I think obviously the thing that makes this a lot easier is having a cushion, right? So a gap between what you're earning and what you're spending. And that's harder when you're not making as much. So honestly, what we did early on with those, when you're in your late 20s and people are starting to get married and trips that you mentioned, we just rated the savings account, right? We rated the emergency fund. Probably not the best advice, but it was easier than we didn't have to pay anybody interest. We didn't have to, but we had the habit of that money being refilled, right? We had already built a multi-year, getting onto a multi-year habit of filling up that account. And so when we drew against it, we just turned that faucet back on and started dripping money back into it until we could get it back up to speed. I never, like, that was hard for me. Like, I hated seeing, I hated dipping back into it because it, is this really an emergency kind of thing? But that's what we did early on. And now, we've grown our incomes. That gap is much bigger. Honestly, it's almost like kind of slush fund money. Like, we can make relatively easily, we can make a couple big decisions about, let's postpone this a month or two. We move this around here, and we just cash flow it, honestly.
You're
partly with the fact that
we're more robust now.
That's right. And partly because, again, we've already kind of earmarked some spending that we know is going to be chunky every year, right? We know that the vacation money, we budget every month, but we know we're going to use it a couple times a year. And so the combination of that, and then just having some extra gap between what we earn and spend, it's nice to be in a position where it doesn't cause me stress anymore to kind of handle those types of things.
Yeah. When you were early in your financial life, did you ever say like, okay, it's not so much like a wedding coming up where I'm going to need to pull something aside out of the emergency fund, but did you ever say like, I'm just going to throw a few extra bucks here or there, or maybe I'm going to take a couple little side hustles just to fill up this so that when it's time, it's there? Or was it more like, you know what, we're pretty strapped, and this is the way it's going to go forward until the income really goes up and the expenses, whether there's student loan payments or things like that, start to subside a little bit?
Yeah, again, I think maybe my partner and I are good examples of this. So it kind of depends. I think it depends on the career. So I in preparing for a career in academics, I didn't spend a lot of mental energy on side gigs or side hustles. Like, to me, the more I could invest in this path, the payoff was going to be big enough. Now,
Yeah.
my partner as a nurse, especially when we were in school, working, shifts at the hospital, she could take on some extra shifts if we needed to, right? Like being an hourly
Right.
employee, again,
Right.
in demand. And it wasn't like we had to pivot to like delivering pizzas, or Uber didn't exist at the time, but something equivalent to
Right.
that.
Right.
We kind of
Bartending at
stayed,
night or
right,
whatever.
right. We stayed within our career path. But even there, I think, the RN position allowed for some flexibility where, she could pick up some extra money relatively easily. Harder
Yeah.
for me to do as a kind of a student, kind of, new PhD. But I knew that if I kept focusing on papers and grants, that my payoff would come, down the road.
Interesting. Two approaches to long-term, sustainable, rewarding careers. One is put your head down, focus, don't get distracted, put all of your effort into becoming a tenured professor, a highly published professor, an economist. And then on the flip side, your partner is quite successful in her career, but had a little bit more fluidity in those early years where she could go, put in an extra 12 hours a week and see some nice significant return on investment.
Yeah.
That's a good position. Go ahead.
I like the idea, Brett, of your point's a good one. It's not just, can we crank back the spending, right? The gap is what's important. So if
Right.
if there's ways to bring in more money, that accomplishes the same thing, right? So
Yeah.
especially, I mean, all the stuff I'm describing is like 15 to 20 years ago. So,
Understood. Yeah.
the stuff that's available now for that kind of extra earning is way more accessible and way more, easily adaptable for people. So definitely don't forget about that when you're trying to hit these goals.
Yeah. And I think that's, not to go back and forth on how you and we are teaching our kids about money. But what you're suggesting is a very high level view of a career. And the modern economy, like you were saying, like 20 years ago, like if you wanted to make a little extra money and you were an economist, it was bartending at night because you were an economist from 9 in the morning until 5 or 6 in the evening, Monday through Friday. And then the options were waiting tables, bartending, maybe a valet or something like that. But there wasn't the option of an eBay side hustle where you could go, to TJ Maxx, or you could go to garage sales or things like that on the weekend and find some really good deals and then mark them up on eBay. There wasn't the option of being an Uber driver at 2:00 in the morning doing airport runs or doing, bar runs and things like that, where you're going to make some money kind of in those vacant hours. Into today's world, let's just, for example, you're a PhD student that's just wrapping up. You're living off of a stipend. You're doing your 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. You're hustling a little bit to, get your research in, your writing in. Maybe you're putting in a half day on Sunday, but you need a little extra income. What's your approach?
I would probably look. So the discipline I'm in is very data driven. We work with a lot of data, a lot of statistics. That's in high demand. I would be looking to build, if you were sort of formal, a 5-year plan, basically I'd be building like a data consultancy sort of thing. But in the meantime, I'd be looking for, I mean, you could even start on like Amazon Turk or something, right? But like basically, like I'm looking to build a reputation of like, look, you give me some data, I can help you give some answers out of it, and start building a sort of a line of work in that. Because one, I've already learned how to do it. Two, I enjoy it. And, three, there's a demand for it in the market. So that's probably where I would go, is kind of start building towards that kind of side consultancy.
And you have a core competency that would put you ahead of other people in that market.
Right. Right.
Particularly like, say you're coming right out of college. It's like, I got time. I've got the expertise. I'm going to just create this account. I can sit up in my room at, 11, 12 o'clock at night, and I can bang out some work, make a little bit of money.
Right.
That's great. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we can kind of summarize everything. But when you think about savings, what for you was an intimidation towards savings, whether it's now or whether it was when your kids were born or when you very first started your kind of financial freedom in your financial life? When you sat back and were like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? I personally can think of a half dozen things without much effort, and I think that's one of the things about being financially independent is navigating the things that scare you and peacefully managing the things that excite you and that you're good at. So kind of making the best of both worlds. What was it for you?
I think it was probably the size of the goals. So as soon as you start thinking about we want to buy a house, or let's say you actually take my advice and you think about, okay, well, maybe let's 62, we'll get out a couple years early, travel. Here's what I think we'll need to spend. And you get the number back and it's, 2.2 million, right? And you're sitting there at 26, 27. You're like,
Right.
I have no idea what that kind of money looks like.
How am I
right?
going to save $2.2 million
Yeah.
when I'm making X thousands a year, right?
Yeah.
Not hundreds of thousands, not whatever, but yeah.
Right. Moving from,
yeah.
5-digit income to, multiple 6-figure assets, right? Like, how does that work? And it's just intimidating. I don't think humans are good at thinking about numbers that big all the time, so that was probably the most intimidating. How did I approach it? I think eventually
what was a Friday night conversation or a Tuesday afternoon conversation with your partner about, like, hey, here's the reality, and this is really intimidating. What were those moments like? What was that conversation like?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like carrots and sticks to this, right? So like at some level you can kind of take the fear and say, well, I mean, we're going to need that much money. Like, I better get started now. Right. And so there's that side of it. The carrots are also knowing that, if you've ever played around with like a retirement calculator, you really learn fast how much the time horizon matters, and how, starting just a few years earlier means that what you have to put away a month is way less than you'd think, right? So you do these comparisons where if I wait till 35 versus I start at 25, and that can turn into a positive as well, right? Like, oh, well, I was that young person. If I start now, it won't be as big a deal as if, compared to if I wait longer. So it's kind of like two sides of the same coin, I guess, but it's a big number. But it's also realizing that it's far enough away that the best thing we can do is just to get started on it. So that's eventually what we did. We just kind of jumped in and said, well, there's no way this isn't magically going to fix itself. Like, we just got to get going.
Yeah. There's a lot of it, and I'm sure in a lot of folks, like just everyday life, when you stumble upon advice or theories about savings or building your career or things, there's so many one-liners that I think do a disservice to the endeavor that you're embarking on. The simple ones are the Rome wasn't built in a day, and how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time, right? Like, yeah, it took a long time to create the Roman Empire, and it took a long time to do this and that, but you can't really summarize a human's lifetime earnings and responsibility and the complexity of saving for retirement, saving for your kids to go to college, saving for an emergency, validating the work that you're doing in the moment and enjoying your life in the moment, and digesting all of that at once. Like, it's a very emotional, complicated path to navigate, ripe with opportunities to make errors. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is just start it and acknowledge it and take one step at a time. Fair?
Yep. Yeah. And like I said, I would start, I would automate it. I wouldn't, especially for the really long-term stuff, like you did with your E-Trade account, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it. Like, once you get everything set up, and I would just make sure that discretionary spending that you have at the end is just spent on things that, truly make you happy. They don't necessarily have to be expensive.
Awesome. Very thoughtful, much appreciated of the kind of the internal look at what you're doing, how you've approached the last 20 years of, everything, but particularly, like I was saying, it's a complex roadmap, and you're, halfway, if not 2/3 of the way through it. So being able to look back on what you've accomplished, I'm sure A, feels good, and B, you can kind of glean some pretty awesome nuggets of advice. So I appreciate you sharing all of that info with us. We'll have
Thanks,
a few summaries. Yeah, absolutely. A few summaries, a few bits on the website. I love the champagne waterfall wedding approach to savings. And it's like, once that first one's full, then the second one's going to get full, then the third one's going to get full. And if the champagne is still flowing down, drink the champagne. So we'll leave it at that. But that was fantastic. As always, I appreciate the candor and the input and pulling the curtain back on something that can be quite intimidating and quite daunting to the uneducated financial planner and family financial operator for your household or whatever. So awesome as always. Thank you so much. Look forward to another chat soon.
All right, me too.